Friends, tonight we're cooking a Rye Field Sturmtiger with partial interior and a decent load of accessories. It'll eventually become a part of a large diorama, but that's a story for another video. Even the figures will come in later, but I wanted to give you a little tease to set the mood. So let's jump right in. I always like to start by assembling the major parts of the hull. It gives me a quick idea of how well the model fits together. And right off the bat, the very first part I glued didn't. After fiddling with it for a few minutes, I realized the top plate actually works as a pretty decent spacer. Same deal with the rear plate, as if the entire lower hull was slightly crooked. I think we're off to a good start. Next up, some early prep work. I wasn't sure how much of the floor would actually stay visible, so I played it safe and removed all the ejector pin marks. What I was sure about though was the headlight mounting plate, which was getting replaced with a metal part. This is what I call the destructive phase of the build. It's pretty much standard routine for me, cutting away parts I plan to replace, scribing deeper weld lines with chisels, the whole nine. Tasks like these can seem messy, and if you don't trust the process, even a bit discouraging, but it will make sense later. The end result will be miles ahead of what the kit gives you out of the box. Filling large holes is much quicker when you have scrap pieces of styrene sheet lying around, because plastic doesn't sink like modeling putty. To finish things off, I enhanced the panel lining around the splash guard and also drilled out the holes which were on all Tigers but are somehow missing here. We can now begin with the texturing stage, and for that I used my favorite combo, Tamiya putty mixed with Mr. Cement S. One of the most common questions I get is about the brushes. How do I clean them? Can they be reused? And if it is better to use old ones? The answers are yes, yes, and absolutely. For the first question, I cleaned them in Mr. Cement S. No black magic, and kinda obvious if you ask me. I even received this question multiple times on Instagram, where, by the way, I returned a few weeks ago. After 6 years, I finally remembered my password, so if you're there, drop me a follow, but please don't slide into my DMs. Once the steel texture was done, I gave it a light beauty pass with a fine sanding sponge and then moved on to the flame cut marks. Luckily, I had tons of reference photos of the real tank on display at the Münster Museum in Germany, and I was very pleased to see how gloriously rough around the edges the real Sturmi was. After all, these rocket tanks were cobbled together from recycled Tiger hulls. That doesn't have to do anything with the roughness of the flame cuts, but the photos gave me the green light to crank the texturing dial all the way to 11. Case in point, I noticed that they decided to hastily grind away the material around the shackle attachment points, as if the steel plates were too chunky. This is what I love about texturing and rough detailing. And for reasons unknown, probably the existence of reference images, I decided to add a whole bunch of rivets on the underside of the sponsons, aka the part nobody will see, but you know they're there now. So I expect at least one like and subscribe out of sheer respect. The final stage of the texturing process is welding. As always, I'm using the yellow Tamiya epoxy putty quick type. I honestly don't know why, but welding a Tiger is one of the most satisfying tasks I ever experienced. It brought me back to my early YouTube days with the Tiger F13. Maybe it's because some of the welds are so chunky and beautifully textured on the real vehicle. Or maybe it's just the overall shape of the hull, a big armored shoebox made of thick steel plates held together in sometimes pretty creative ways. As always, it's important to think about the logistics of the process. You don't want to end up with too much wasted putty, and you want it to stick to the surface during application and be sturdy during texturing. As such, I filled as many weld lines as I could before the putty stopped being too clingy, and then I went to town with my texturing tools. The C-shape was sculpted with a piece of soda can I bent into a half pipe around a toothpick, and the long straight welds were crafted with a curved hobby blade. The Sturmi I'm building is a well-documented, knocked-out vehicle from Oberampt, Germany, February 1945. It was taken out from behind by an American tank destroyer after it got stuck in a ditch and through its right track. The impacts are the most bizarre thing, because let's be honest here, if I made this up and made 3 penetrating impacts in a straight line, would you buy it? Or would you call me out for being totally unrealistic? Either way, I must admit that I messed up a little bit, because I have mistaken the remnants of weld beads for bounced impacts. Later in the video, you'll see that I quietly fixed this mistake off camera and even added another hit that grazed the edge of the rear plate and continued into the superstructure. Judging by the visible damage, the first round was probably high explosive. It caused a lot of surface spalling, tore off every fragile part, but clearly didn't spank the butt hard enough to end the fight, because then they switched to AP rounds. I also wanted to quickly get the suspension out of the way, and luckily the torsion bar system allows us to keep it functional just like in real life. You'll see later that I use this to my advantage, but for now, let's keep it the way it is, nice and wavy. And let's admire the whole thing for a while, completely ignore the fighting compartment, and let's add the Zimmerit. Before we jump into the fun stuff, we've got some less exciting prep work to take care of. With the standard Zimmerit pattern, it always ends up looking a bit thick, no matter how thin you spread the putty. That's just the nature of the texture itself and the tools we're using, but there's a simple, albeit slightly time-consuming trick to fix it. Slice off the surface details, in this case the side skirt mounting plates, and glue them onto a thin sheet of styrene. This acts as a spacer and compensates for the thickness of the Zimmerit, so once everything's done, the details won't look like they're sinking into the putty. The same approach works great for tool mounts, which are especially easy when the kit gives us clear placement guides. Okay, let's start on the easiest and most fun type of the surface, one with no detail standing in your way. Back when I was building the Tiger F13, I used the yellow Quick-Type putty, but after the Yak Panther project, I quickly changed my mind. Tamiya Smooth Surface putty is an absolute beast. It's softer, dries slower, and spreads more easily in a thin layer. Note how the grey steel plate is shining through the thin layer of putty. That's the best indicator you're applying it correctly. Texturing is super easy with the plastic roller from Trumpeter. Yup, still the same one I used on my first Tiger, even though there are probably dozens of newer, more sophisticated tools now. It's important to apply enough pressure so the tool reaches the plastic underneath. If you can see the grey base showing through in the deepest parts of every ridge, that means the Zimmerit is as thin as it can get, and that's the goal. Honestly, it's a ton of fun and not difficult at all. Realistic damage is also a piece of cake. On this example, you can see how in some spots the Zimmerit is as thin as those 3D stickers, which are another option, although I don't find them very cash money. The sides are more complicated because they have lots of details that need to be avoided, but if we approach it just like in real life, it's still easy and looks pretty good. The putty cures slowly enough that I managed to do the entire side plate in one session, while on the old Tiger I had to split it into 2 stages. When working in tight spaces and around details, it's important to apply the texture first using a dedicated stamp. I know it looks messy and ugly on its own, but it's the only way to do it properly because the roller just won't reach there. Basically, I'd say there's no way to mess up the Zimmerit if you keep it thin and in scale. It doesn't need to look perfect, and the vertical columns don't have to be perfectly straight. On real tanks, the finish was often very ugly, sometimes downright atrocious. So once again, keep it thin, use appropriate tools even if they're cheap or basic, stay patient, and you'll end up with a very authentic, custom result that's entirely your own without relying on aftermarket solutions. Moving on, the next stages were basically just about assembling plastic parts from the kit. No drastic modifications, just putting pieces together. The entire engine compartment had a pretty tight fit, and I suspect that was, once again, because of the crooked lower hull. I didn't bother adding any missing weld details here because mixing putty for such a small area just isn't time efficient. I wasn't even planning to use the photo etch mesh screens yet, but I needed them in place so I could add the plastic hooks on the smaller air intakes. While we're at it, here's a cool and simple trick that everyone should use on these details. Add a bit of texture with a blunt, smooth object. It'll make them look more three-dimensional and nicely worn in. That pretty much wraps up all the major assembly on the lower hull. So it's time to move on to the superstructure. The roof comes molded in clear plastic, which looks totally awesome and kind of freaky at the same time. But unfortunately, this version of the kit doesn't include a full interior, and even if it did, it wouldn't suit my diorama-oriented plans. So, as I was adding texture, I went over the inner side of that beautiful, shiny panel as well. The giant mortar has visible rifling, and every kit ever tries to solve it with a photo-etched tube that you have to roll yourself. I mean, no thanks. I went with this beautiful digital version from Colt 3D, printed on my Saturn IV Ultra. It fits the kit perfectly, and the whole tube has a gnarly cast steel texture. No sanding needed to hide the print lines because the putty takes care of that. You'll find it on the site if you search for a Sturmtiger. It's open priced, and personally, I'm always happy to support 3D artists doing solid work. When I said it fits like a glove, I truly meant it. Every part that's supposed to connect to the original plastic piece just slots right in. The rest of the interior was all about adding the countless small details. Not my favorite type of work, but it's definitely gonna be fun to paint. Before I moved on to the final details, I quickly turned my attention to the exterior of the fighting compartment and gave it the usual texturing treatment. The reason for this little jump in the workflow is simple. Texturing sometimes requires a firmer approach, so to say. I often need to press harder on the surface or grip the model more tightly, and I've built enough kits to know that fragile details and rough handling don't get along. So that's why I did this after I did that, and before I did the other thing. And now for the worst part of the build, the ammo racks. Tiny, fragile pieces just aren't my thing. I get it why interior kits appeal to a lot of people, but for me, this stuff just isn't enjoyable. To make myself happier, I bought and 3D printed those fat 38cm rockets. Not because the plastic ones were worse in any way, but simply because I like 3D printing. Now, I'm no expert on these, but the museum piece in Munster shows some serious surface texture. Maybe it's corrosion, or maybe the casings were cast, like bombs. Or maybe not. I didn't care enough to do the research. Either way, this entire section was painful and not fun at all. And judging from what others have said about this kit, I wasn't alone. Okay, with the interior finally out of the way, I can snap the fighting compartment in place and move on to the parts that are actually enjoyable, such as the running gear. I know, who enjoys working on a tank running gear? I'll tell you, people who just suffered PTSD from the interior. And let me tell you, after all that, this felt like therapy. Because of the moving suspension and the future diorama in mind, I was tempted to keep the wheels separate. But then I weighed both options. Sure, articulated suspension is cool, but painting each wheel on a toothpick, not so much. So I went with my traditional approach. But first, I had to glue the suspension arms in place. And since this tank will have only one track, I also had to account for the elevation difference between the two sides. If you've been following my channel for a while, you probably saw this coming. Gluing the wheels together with generous amounts of super glue. Well, maybe you didn't need to be an OG viewer since I did the same thing earlier this year on the E100. Now this will be much more fun to paint. You already got a sneak peek of the assembled track, and this, my friends, is again some beautiful craftsmanship from Pantherwork. I'm starting to look like a total 3D printed track fanboy, and honestly, I'm not even hiding it. The details are always crisp and delicate, but what really wins me over is how easy they are to assemble. Just really fun to work with. That subtle click when the securing pin locks in place, so satisfying. One crucial detail for all your tired Tigers are the worn out ice cleats on the inner sides. Also, assembling just one track instead of two felt pretty great. Took me just a bit over an hour and I didn't even have time to get bored. Now we're finally at the maximum fun part, the final stages full of small details, photo etch, different textures and materials. Honestly, I really enjoyed this stuff. Handles, electric cables and other round bits always look better and are easier to do with copper wire. They're stronger and perfectly round. You can even add weld beads around them, or if they're too tiny, just blend them into the surface with some diluted putty. It's interesting how a decade or two ago, cool modelers were hoarding cast resin aftermarket pieces. Now, it's all about resin 3D prints. Luckily, the quality nowadays is usually spot on, which wasn't always the case with those handmade pieces back in the day. I wasn't totally sure where the electric cable should go on this one, so that's all just guesswork on my part. You might remember these shackles from my previous Sturmtiger video. I printed them in bulk because they're way more detailed than the plastic parts, although a bit longer than the real ones according to my references. But I'm totally cool with that because they have a functional pin and I can thread a wire through it, just like the real deal. Here's a cool way of combining the photo etch parts from Voyager with the original plastic. The towing rope clamps are supposed to be replaced entirely with photo etch, but I decided to adapt them to the molded on plastic bases. It saves time and actually looks more authentic, since the bases were solid steel in real life. Also, I've got to give a shout out to the ultimate VMS black super glue and debonder combo. If you work fast, before the glue fully sets, you can wipe away the excess quickly and efficiently. The links are in the description, and don't forget to use the sales coupons if you want to give them a try. All of the tiny photo etch pieces can be bent by hand with tweezers. What I really like about them is how precise they are. They fit together perfectly every single time, as long as your hands do their part as well. And if you want to, you can keep them fully functional. Here you can see that I've already reworked the shell impacts, and those little rectangles are the remnants of the jack plug holders, completely blown off by the high explosive shell. Let's now do some extra work on the mufflers. One of the exhaust stacks was damaged by the impacts, so I decided to replicate the damage using copper foil. After softening it over a flame, I wrapped it around the original piece, marked out its length with a blade, cut it to size, and it turned out to be a really easy upgrade. Then I removed the plastic from the damaged section and superglued the metal sleeve in place. Shrapnel damage was added with a needle, which also created realistic dents around each hit. The crumpled areas were shaped using the blunt end of a paintbrush. To finish it off, I sanded away the excess glue and placed the seam where it won't be visible. The rain cover and its support rods are always thick in these kits, and upgrading them isn't exactly straightforward, but honestly, it's these mildly annoying jobs that end up feeling the most satisfying. Die-hard Tiger fans would definitely appreciate a set of 3D printed exhausts, so if you're into 3D modeling, this might be a cool project to take on. The armored covers were textured and welded the usual way. What surprised me was the gnarly remnants of casting sprues I noticed on the real vehicle. Absolutely delightful. It instantly brought back memories of my IS-2 project. A bit of planning also goes a long way. The armored cover conveniently hides the seam between the copper sleeve and the plastic part. The other exhaust is completely hidden behind the sheet metal covering. So far, I've never added these to any of my German builds. And finally, the bucket. It's another 3D printed part, this time from a Ukrainian company called Spalach Models. So that's the backplate finished, and it's an absolute beauty, isn't it? For large pieces such as the side skirts or mudguards, handheld tools won't cut the mustard, so a dedicated photo edge bending tool is required. Once again, if you're careful and precise, everything fits exactly where it should. I didn't even need to use my soldering iron for this build. Everything was assembled easily with super glue. Metal fenders are fantastic when you want to add realistic battle damage. The front skirt took some flack from a sneaky impact near the front road wheel, and even though I usually prefer my steel cats without skirts, this one is going to look awesome. Those bent and mangled pieces will add a lot of visual eye candy. The only parts I didn't enjoy were the front mudguards. They might look simple at the first glance, just plain square sheets, right? Wrong! Their assembly is surprisingly complicated. Bending these functional hinges was actually the easy part. Still, it's another fully functional piece, and this time I'm keeping them that way. And there's also something unusual. They also had a layer of Zimmerit. One mudguard will be folded like this, and the other one like this, just to make the model a little more interesting. The final piece I wasn't really looking forward to, but that turned out to be surprisingly straightforward, was the loading crane for those giant rockets. The steel rope is made from twisted 0.2mm copper wire, and it's black because I softened it over a flame. It's gonna stay movable and look absolutely fabulous. I wrapped up the build by adding a few more missing weld beads on the hatches. The small one is hinged and will stay open, while the big one was removable in real life, so it'll rest on the roof just like this. And with that, my mission was complete. Alright, my friends, I know I said that after the Sturmtiger we'd take a break from tanks and armored vehicles on tracks. But there was a change of plans. The model I originally wanted to build would take ages just to get ready for painting, and I wanted something smaller for the summer. Also, while I was editing the raw steel video with the Sturmtiger, I went to the movies with my girlfriend, and then in the parking lot I proposed to her. Now I don't have a girlfriend anymore, because now she's my fiancée. So yeah, we're in full wedding prep mode, and now you can probably see why I went for a smaller model that I can split into more manageable video chunks. Speaking of which, the next video will be all about painting the interior, and it's coming out next week. In the meantime, thanks for watching and for sticking with me all this time. When I started this channel, I was baby night shift. Then I became Uncle Night Shift, and now my anime arc is slowly turning me into Hot Husband Night Shift. I wouldn't be able to run my channel full time without my patrons. They keep the lights flowing and the paints on, and if you're one of them, thank you from the deepest parts of my chest. My Patreon is honestly the coolest place. I post regular updates, share work in progress photos, thoughts from the workbench, and besides that, we keep in touch through DMs, comments and emails. Top tier patrons also get early access to all my videos, completely ad-free, and they stay there forever, which is perfect for watching them like a podcast. There are also bonus extras like 3D printable parts for your own projects, reference photos from real life locations, and high-res studio shots of my models that show way more detail than video ever could. Your financial support is appreciated but never expected. This model took me almost 3 weeks to assemble, so hopefully the painting will flow more quickly. Again, stay tuned for the next week and the interior, and remember, build your models, don't just hoard them. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers!